The first time the widow poured his whiskey, her hand trembled just enough for him to notice. It wasn't fear, no, it was something quieter, something carried for far too long. The saloon in Red Hollow breathed low and tired that night. Lantern light swayed against smoke-darkened beams, and the smell of dust and spilled liquor clung to the air like a ghost. Outside, the wind scraped the street like a dull blade. Inside, men drank to forget names they still remembered. The widow never spoke unless spoken to. She wore black, always black, though the edges had softened with years of wear. Her hair, streaked with early gray, was pulled back tight. Her eyes were steady but guarded like a door locked from the inside. Folks just called her Mrs. Calder. Few remembered her first name anymore. And every single night, without fail, she served Elias Boone his whiskey. Same stool. Same hour, same quiet nod. Elias had ridden into Red Hollow 3 months earlier, as thin as a fence rail and heavy with things he didn't say. A former gunman turned ranch drifter, he carried the look of a man who'd buried more than he'd ever planted. The brim of his hat shadowed eyes that had learned not to hope for anything. The very first night, he ordered a whiskey. The widow poured it. Their eyes met for just a half-second too long. Then she looked away, and that was how it all began. Night after night, Elias returned. Sometimes he drank slow, nursing the glass. Sometimes he didn't finish it at all. And sometimes he just sat there with the glass untouched, staring at the far wall like it might offer him an answer if he waited long enough. The widow watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. He noticed. And every night, after she served him his drink, she would slip out the back door. Elias noticed that too. Red Hollow was the kind of town that pretended it didn't see things. Men didn't ask questions unless the answers could make them either rich or dead. Still, there were whispers. She had a husband once, one would say, lost him to fever, another would counter. No, it was a gunfight. I heard she had a child. No, the child died, but everyone agreed on one thing. The widow lived alone in a small, isolated house beyond the cottonwoods, near the creek where the land dipped low and the nights turned cold fast. Elias didn't know why he cared. He told himself it was just a habit, just something to notice besides the roar of his own thoughts. But there was something in the way she watched him, like she was measuring the weight of his presence. As if each night he returned tightened something deep inside her chest. One evening, as a storm began to gather beyond the dusty windows, Elias finally spoke more than just 2 words. "Your husband," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on his glass. "What was he like?" The widow froze. The constant noise of the saloon seemed to dull, as if the room itself was leaning in to listen. She set the bottle down slowly. After a long moment, she said, "He was kind. And he trusted the wrong men." Elias nodded once. He understood that kind of kindness all too well. "Did he die quick?" Elias asked, his voice low. "No," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. "He died waiting." That answer stayed with Elias long after he left the saloon that night. The storm broke hard. Rain lashed the streets in sheets and thunder rolled like distant cannon fire. Elias pulled his coat tight and headed for the livery stable, but as he passed the saloon's dark side alley, he heard something that stopped him cold. A child's cough. Soft, sickly, and coming from somewhere behind the saloon. Elias turned, peering into the gloom. The widow stood there, half hidden in the shadows, holding a small bundle wrapped in a blanket tight against her chest. She didn't see him at first. She was completely focused on the child, whispering soft, soothing words, not knowing anyone else was near. Elias felt his breath catch in his throat. Children were a rare sight in Red Hollow. Rarer still were ones hidden away like secrets. Then the widow looked up. Their eyes locked across the rain-swept darkness. And for the first time since he'd known her, raw fear flickered across her face. Elias began, then stopped himself. He lowered his voice. "Is he all right?" She hesitated, weighing something much heavier than the truth. "He gets sick when the weather turns," she finally said. Elias took a step back, instinctively giving her space. "Didn't mean to pry." She gave him a stiff nod and turned away, disappearing into the downpour. But something had already shifted between them. The secret was out. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. The sound of that cough echoed in his chest. The shape of the child in her arms. The way the widow held him, not like a servant, not like a keeper, but like a mother who had already lost far too much. The next evening, Elias arrived at the saloon earlier than usual. The widow visibly stiffened when she saw him walk through the door. He didn't order a whiskey. Instead, he placed a small leather pouch on the scarred wooden bar. "For medicine," he said plainly, "or blankets. Whatever he needs." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She just stared at the pouch. "I ain't asking any questions," Elias added gently. "Just don't let him suffer if you can help it." For a long moment she didn't move. Then, she slowly slid the pouch back toward him. "I can't," she whispered, her voice strained. "Not from you." Elias frowned, confused. "Why?" Her eyes glistened with unshed tears just for a second. "Because some debts don't come due in coin." Before he could say another word, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there with the pouch and 1,000 new questions. The storm that night was even worse than the last one. The wind howled like a living, wounded thing. Elias left the saloon feeling restless, his gut tight with an unease he couldn't name. Halfway to the livery, he heard it again. The child's cough. But it was stronger now. Closer. Elias followed the sound, past the edge of town, beyond the cottonwoods, all the way to the widow's little house. Candlelight flickered from inside. The front door stood cracked open, rattling violently in the wind. He knocked. No answer. He pushed the door wider. "Mrs. Calder?" Inside, the house was small but warm. A single room with a stove, a table, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. The widow was kneeling beside it. The child lay pale against the blankets, his small chest rising and falling unevenly, his breath shallow and fast. "He's burning up," Elias said quietly from the doorway. She looked up at him, her eyes red from crying. "I know. Let me help." She shook her head, a tear finally tracing a path down her cheek. "You already have." Elias stepped closer despite himself, drawn by a force he didn't understand. The lamplight fell across the child's face. And in that moment, Elias felt the entire world tilt on its axis. The boy's dark hair curled the exact same way his had as a child. His jawline soft now with youth but unmistakable. And the faint scar near his left eyebrow. A scar Elias remembered earning himself, long, long ago, from a fall off a corral fence back home. His knees felt weak. He could barely stand. "No," Elias breathed, the word a choked whisper. The widow closed her eyes, as if in surrender. And in that profound silence, Elias finally understood. The whiskey, the quiet glances, the hidden child, it had all been leading to this single, devastating moment. Outside, the storm raged on, mirroring the tempest inside him. Inside, Elias Boone stared at the face of a child he had never known. A child who looked exactly like him. And before he could find his voice, the widow whispered the words that shattered what little peace he had left. "His name is Samuel. And he's your son. Thank you for watching." If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter of our journey. See you next time. The room seemed to shrink around me as the widow's words settled into the air. "Your son." I stared at the boy Samuel, his chest fluttering with each labored breath. The storm outside pressed against the walls, rain rattling the roof like restless fingers, but I heard none of it. All I could hear was the echo of my own past, riding hard toward me at last. "My son," I said it again, barely audible. "That ain't possible." "The widow Clara Calder," she said finally, because the truth demanded names now rose slowly to her feet. Her hands shook as she wiped them on her apron. "You rode out of Red Hollow 9 years ago," she said. "You left after the Miller shootout. You never looked back." I swallowed hard. "I left because I was told to." She met my eyes. "You left because you believed you were poison." That cut deeper than any bullet. I dragged a chair closer to the bed and sat, elbows on my knees, staring at the floorboards. "I didn't know," I said. "If I had—" "You would have died," Clara interrupted softly. I looked up. "Men were hunting you," she went on. "The same men who killed my husband. They would have used the child to draw you out." I couldn't risk it. I laughed once, a bitter broken sound. "So you let me believe there was nothing left worth staying for." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I let you live." Silence stretched between us, thick with years unspoken. Samuel coughed again, his small hand twitching against the blanket. I reached out before I could stop myself, laying 2 fingers gently against his wrist. The pulse was weak. "Doctor," I said, standing up. "He needs a doctor." Clara just shook her head. "The nearest one's 2 days' ride. I'll ride." "You can't." "I will." She grabbed my sleeve, her voice desperate. "If they see you—" "I ain't hiding anymore." Her grip loosened. "You don't know what you're saying." I knelt beside the bed again, my own voice steadier now, forged in this sudden, fierce fire. I know exactly what I'm saying. I spent half my life running from the man I was. I won't spend the rest running from the man I should have been. I stood pulling on my coat. I'll be back by morning. The ride was brutal. The wind tore at me like a wild animal. Rain soaked me through to the bone. But I rode like a man possessed. Chasing more than just time, I rode like a man reclaiming a piece of his soul that had been stolen. By dawn, I returned, a doctor in tow and a sack of medicine tied to my saddle. Samuel lived through that night. The fever, that stubborn thief, finally broke by noon, and I didn't leave after that. How could I? I made my bed in that worn-out chair beside his bed, my hat pulled low over my eyes, waking at every small sound. I learned the shape of my son's breathing, the quiet rhythm of his life. I saw the way he frowned when the morning light was too bright, and I heard the soft hum he made when he was lost in dreams. Dreams I hoped were better than the reality he was living. Clara watched it all, her expression a mix of exhaustion and a guarded hope I hadn't seen before. On the third day, Samuel woke fully. His eyes, clear and bright for the first time, looked at me with a child's pure curiosity. "Mama?" he called out, his voice small but strong. Clara smiled through her tears. "Yes, sweetheart." Then his gaze shifted back to me. "Who's he?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I felt my chest tighten, my throat go dry. I glanced at Clara, completely unsure of what to say. She gave me a single, slow nod. It was all the permission I needed. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "My name's Elias," I said gently. I'm someone who should have been here sooner." Samuel studied my face, my weathered skin, my tired eyes. Then he reached out a small hand, his tiny fingers brushing against my beard. "You look tired," he said. A laugh escaped my lips, a rusty, unfamiliar sound. "I am, son. I am." He smiled, and in that smile, I saw the sun break through the clouds of my long, dark life. That night, after Samuel was asleep, Clara finally told me everything. We sat at the small kitchen table, the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. She spoke of how she'd loved me once, all those years ago, before my world had crumbled. She told me how she'd waited, hoping I'd return. Then the whispers started, rumors that I was dead, buried in some unmarked grave. She'd heard it so many times she began to believe it. Samuel was born during a winter so harsh she'd nearly frozen holding him, her love for him the only thing keeping her alive. She'd taken the job at the saloon, pouring whiskey for drifters and gamblers, because it paid steady and the owner asked no questions. And why the whiskey? I asked quietly, the question that had haunted me for weeks. Clara looked down at her hands, resting on the table. "Because it kept you coming back. And because every night I poured it, I wondered if you could ever forgive me." I closed my eyes, the weight of her words settling over me. "I forgave you the moment I saw him, but forgiveness didn't mean safety. You can't hide a man like me in a town like Red Hollow for long." My presence was soon noticed. Men watched from shadowed doorways. Conversations hushed when I passed on the street. The air grew thick with suspicion. Then, one evening, as I stepped out of the saloon, a familiar voice stopped me cold. "Well, I'll be damned." The ghost of Elias Boone. The voice was like gravel and smoke, a sound from my nightmares. I turned. Harlan Pike stood there older, his face lined with cruelty, but his eyes were the same cold, empty pits. A man whose smile had never once reached them. "You should have stayed gone," Pike drawled. I kept my hands away from my gun, my body rigid. "I'm not looking for trouble, Harlan." He chuckled, a low, menacing sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Trouble's been looking for you, Boone." Later that night, Clara found me in the dim light of our small home, cleaning and loading my revolver. "They know," I said, not needing to look at her. "They know about me. And they know about the boy." Her face went pale in the lamplight. "Then you have to leave, Elias. Go, before it's too late." "No." I looked up, meeting her gaze, letting her see the resolve forged in that brutal ride through the storm. "This time I stay. But you'll get us killed." He met her gaze, his own eyes burning with a dark fire. "Or, I'll keep you alive." Before the sun even thought about rising, the first shots rang out near the edge of town. It wasn't an attack. Not yet. It was a warning. A promise. I stood in the doorway of the house, my old rifle in my hand. The cold metal felt familiar, an extension of my arm. The weight of everything I'd ever lost, and everything I refused to lose again, settled into my bones, grounding me. Inside, in the quiet of the small room, Samuel slept, unaware of the storm gathering just outside his door. A storm I was ready to face. Thanks for watching. If you want to see what happens next in Elias's story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We'll see you in the next one. The morning light came softly to Red Hollow, almost hesitant, as if it wasn't sure peace was welcome here. It crept over the dirt road, touching the closed shutters and empty hitching posts. In the doorway of a small cabin, just past the cottonwoods, Elias Boone stood, a rifle resting on his shoulder. His eyes were fixed on the horizon. He hadn't slept. Every sound held a new weight, the creak of a floorboard, the distant cry of a crow, the whisper of wind through dry grass. Behind him, the world he had nearly lost slept on, unaware. Inside, his son, Samuel, was curled under a thin blanket, his breathing slow and steady. At the table, Clara watched him, her hands wrapped around a cold mug of coffee she hadn't touched. She looked at Elias's back, the solid line of his shoulders, the way he no longer flinched at shadows. That posture used to mean a man was ready to run or to kill. Now, it meant something else entirely. It meant a man had decided where he would make his final stand. The gunshots just before dawn had done more than just wake the town. They had torn open old wounds. By mid-morning, Red Hollow was buzzing with nervous whispers. Men gathered in small, tense groups, their voices low. The name Elias Boone moved through the streets like a ghost returning from a forgotten grave, a name half feared, half remembered as unfinished business. And wherever there was unfinished business, Harlan Pike was never far behind. Pike had built his life on one simple, brutal belief. Fear was a stronger currency than love. For years it had worked. Men backed down. Towns turned a blind eye. But as he rode toward the cabin with two grim-faced men at his side, Pike felt something different in the air. The land itself felt settled, and that unsettled him more than anything. Elias saw them coming long before they reached the property. He didn't wait. He stepped forward, closing the distance himself, making sure the danger never got close to the door behind him. From inside, Clara watched, her breath caught in her throat. She held Samuel's small hand, which was curled tightly in the fabric of her dress. She didn't pray for miracles anymore. She prayed for strength. Pike pulled his horse to a stop, dust swirling around his boots as he dismounted. His smile was a familiar, cruel curve, the same one he'd used on a lifetime of broken men. He started talking about the past, about blood that was still owed, about how some men never really change. Elias listened patiently, his silence a stark contrast to Pike's threats. When Pike finally finished his speech, Elias answered, his voice as steady as the ground beneath his feet. I changed the day I stayed. In that moment, Pike realized he'd already lost a fight he didn't even know how to begin. The first of Pike's men moved with a sudden, violent speed. Elias reacted faster. A single shot cracked through the quiet air, sharp and final. It hit the man's hand, sending his gun spinning into the dirt. The second man froze for a heartbeat, then turned and ran without a backward glance. Pike was left standing alone, his eyes wide not with rage, but with a dawning disbelief. Elias didn't advance. He didn't issue a threat. He simply stood there, an immovable wall between Pike and the cabin. By the time the town marshal arrived, drawn by the sound and the scattered witnesses, the confrontation was already over. Pike's blustering anger collapsed into something small and pathetic as the iron cuffs closed around his wrists. He spat out bitter words about the past, about who Elias used to be. Elias said nothing. He just watched Pike get led away, not as a vanquished enemy, but as a chapter of his life finally, blessedly closed. That evening, the small cabin felt warmer than it ever had before. Clara closed the front door and leaned against it, her legs finally trembling now that the danger had passed. Elias set his rifle aside and turned at the sound of small, shuffling footsteps. Samuel was standing in the doorway to his room, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Without a moment's hesitation, Elias knelt down and opened his arms. The boy walked right into them, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, as if he'd always known this was where he belonged. Elias held him close, breathing in the scent of dust and soap and childhood. Years of regret and guilt pressed down on his chest, but then, the weight began to soften. For the first time, it didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like purpose. Days turned into weeks. Red Hollow slowly eased back into its familiar rhythms, but something fundamental had shifted. Elias Boone was no longer a shadow that people whispered about in fear. He was a presence, quiet, steady, and visible. He took odd jobs, mending fences, breaking horses, fixing the things that others had left broken or neglected. Clara left her job at the saloon for good. The stale smell of whiskey was replaced by the warm scent of baking bread, and the cabin walls, which once held only secrets, now echoed with the sound of Samuel's laughter. The boy grew stronger with each passing day. He learned the names of the birds, the sound of his father's footsteps returning home, and the deep comfort of a hand that always came back. Every evening, he would wait by the door, and every evening, Elias would be there. That simple act became the truest, most sacred promise Elias had ever kept. One night, as the sun bled red and gold across the hills, Elias carried Samuel on his shoulders and walked to the edge of their land. It stretched out before them, wide and open, a landscape scarred but still beautiful. Elias spoke softly, not knowing how much his son would understand. "Some men run their whole lives," he said, his voice quiet. "Not because they're weak, but because they don't believe they're worth staying for." Samuel rested his small chin on top of his father's head, listening in that silent way only children can. "And some men," Elias continued, "learn too late that the bravest thing they can ever do is stand still." From the porch, Clara watched them, tears slipping down her cheeks without any shame. She had carried fear for so long that this newfound peace felt strange, almost foreign. But as she saw the silhouettes of her husband and son against the fading light, she knew this peace was real. It was hard-earned. It had been chosen. Red Hollow never built any statues for men like Elias Boone. There were no songs written about him, no grand stories printed in the papers. But years later, when new troubles came and went, people remembered him. They remembered the man who could have ridden away again, but didn't. They said that being a father wasn't about blood or guns or the past you were trying to outrun. Sometimes they said it was just about staying when staying was the hardest thing in the world to do. And in that small cabin past the cottonwoods, where whiskey once hid secrets and fear once ruled the night, a family lived on. They weren't perfect. They weren't untouched by loss. But they were whole. Because in the end, redemption didn't come from forgiveness spoken out loud or from sins being washed away. It came in the quiet moment a man chose not to ride away. Thank you so much for watching. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for more content like this. We'll see you in the next one.